Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to say that tonight's talk is sponsored by one of our longtime patrons, Gerry DiPersia. And Gerry, if you'll stay, there she is, Gerry DiPersia. Now, Gerry has sponsored this lecture in honor of her father, Frank Ruggieri. Now, Frank Ruggieri was a musician of some note. He was a bassoonist. He played with a number of renowned orchestras, including the New York Philharmonic, the National Symphony in Washington, D.C. He played at Radio City Music Hall, and then in his spare time, he became affiliated with the Ocean City Pops, one of the best musical groups in New Jersey, and eventually became the conductor of the Pops. Now, one thing that Gerry's parents decided not to buy in Ocean City, so they just spent the summers there. Unfortunately for Gerry, that it would have been nice, but she spent every summer there, and her father, of course, is still recognized by the Pops as one of the early artists who helped to make that one of the best programs. He spent 23 years at the New York Philharmonic, and he was a man of a great accomplishment, artistic accomplishment, and Gerry tells me also very much a humanist. And I'm sorry I never got to meet him, but I'm sure that Mr. Ruggieri would be very, very pleased to know that you're here tonight to help to celebrate his life. So thank you. Now, as far as tonight's speaker, we're very, very fortunate that tonight we have Professor Cheryl A of Rutgers University. She has a BA degree from Howard in English and a PhD in history of American civilization. Now, in your brochure, I said that she was at the history department at Rutgers, and she kindly corrected me on that and didn't accept the idea. I said, well, in many ways, Professor Walls, this would be a promotion, but I don't think she necessarily agrees with that. But anyway, she, her PhD is in the history of American civilization from Harvard, and she is the Board of Governors Professor of English at Rutgers. She's served there in many capacities, including as a chair of the English department. Now, for me to read all of her publications would take up most of our time tonight, so I'll just mention a few. Professor Wall is the author of Worrying the Line, Black Women Writers, Lineage and Literary Tradition, and Women of the Harlem Renaissance. She also edited Changing Our Own Words, Criticism, Theory, and Writing by Black Women, and she also edited 2 volumes of the writing of Zora Neale Hurston, one of the writers of the Harlem Renaissance. Please join me in welcoming Cheryl Wall to Camden County College.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Pezda, who's already been a phenomenal host this evening. I'd like to thank Gerry DiPersia as well. We got to spend a little time together at dinner and found out that she taught school about 30 blocks from where I grew up in Queens. And also, I'd like to recognize the presence of Dr. Don Borden, the president of Camden County College. I am honored. And I'd like to give a special welcome to those students from Haddon Heights High School. Thank you so much for coming. Thank all of you for coming. And I know that some of you are part of a course on the Roaring Twenties. And so I'm going to speak and give you some background and I am in the English department, so there will be lots of poetry. But I know that you know a lot about the subject that I'm speaking about this evening, so I'm really looking forward to exchanging ideas during the Q&A. Okay, this talk is called City of Dreams, Harlem in the 1920s. Can everybody hear me? Right? Not too loud, not too soft. Okay. I'm going to begin with a poem. And this is a poem, by Count Cullen, one of the most popular poets of the time. And the poem is called Harlem Wine. This is not water running here, these thick rebellious streams that hurtle flesh and bone past fear down alleyways of dreams. This is a wine that must flow on, not caring how or where, so it has ways to flow upon, where song is in the air. So it can woo an artful flute with loose, elastic lips, in measurement of joy compute with blithe, ecstatic hips. Harlem in the 1920s, and should be moving along. Harlem in the 1920s was the dream capital of Black America. In letters home, recent arrivals boasted of the great housing, good jobs, schools, and churches. Hundreds of thousands answered the call. Most found the fancy apartment buildings beyond their means, but even substandard housing in Harlem was better than the tin-roof cabins of the rural South. The jobs available to blacks in New York City were mostly menial, but they paid much better than the agricultural wages common in the South. If few migrants could afford to frequent the clubs that gave Harlem its glamorous veneer, they could hear vibrant music at local bars and at house parties. Their children could attend public schools. Just let me pause there to point out that in many areas of the rural South, the school calendar was not the academic calendar, but the agricultural calendar. So school was not in session when crops needed to be planted or harvested. In many places in the rural South, there were no secondary schools for Black children at all. So one of the real motivations for Black people coming to the North, to Harlem and other northern cities, had to do with the availability of education. In Harlem, migrants could choose from an array of churches with worship styles as austere or demonstrative as they wished. If they ran out of money, they could entertain themselves just by strolling along the broad promenade of 7th Avenue. Free of the surveillance of the Ku Klux Klan and the white terror that threatened Black life in the South, they could embrace a sense of freedom. I'd rather be a lamppost in Harlem than governor of Georgia, went one popular saying. For many, there was no place they would rather be. Beyond the material realities, there was something special about Harlem that could not be pinned down. Count Cullen tried to capture it in that poem, Harlem Wine. The life force of Harlem, as elemental as water, is transfigured in the poem as wine. And this is a shot of 125th Street, then the main thoroughfare of Harlem. The Harlem Wine symbolizes the spirit of the people who come to pursue their dreams, but find that those dreams are up against harsh realities. The newcomers are not dissuaded. The wine must flow on. And a rebellious spirit is necessary to stay the course. That spirit expresses itself through music. Remember, there was a reference to the artful flute and dance. Consequently, the dance is an expression both of rebellion and of joy too profound to measure. The poem speaks both to the jazz that brought pleasure to ordinary Harlemites and to the music that was the poet's muse. If a Black worker is emigrating from the South or the Caribbean, Harlem was the city of dreams. Intellectuals deemed it the culture capital, the greatest Negro city in the world, the Mecca of the new Negro, and the city of refuge. Harlem was the physical embodiment of the spirit of the new Negro. It was indisputably modern. The largest black community in the United States, located as it was in the national cultural capital, Harlem logically became the main setting of the Renaissance. But that was not all there was to it. James Weldon Johnson, one of the earliest historians of Harlem, offers an evocative description. Harlem is indeed the great Mecca for the sightseer, the pleasure seeker, the curious, the adventurous, the enterprising, the ambitious, and the talented of the whole Negro world. For the lure of it has reached down to every island of the Caribbean Sea and has penetrated even into Africa. Harlem in the 1920s was a very cosmopolitan place. While most of its residents had migrated from the rural South and others were native New Yorkers, a significant number came from the Caribbean, representing perhaps 20% of the population in the 1920s. A small, but significant, important number came from Africa. So the whole Harlem is kind of the crossroads of the black world. Johnson, and this is a drawing of James Weldon Johnson by the German artist Wenhol Rice. Johnson was himself a cosmopolite who had achieved success in education, the law, the theater, and the diplomatic service. He knew firsthand how broadly diverse black cultures were. As blacks from different backgrounds interacted in Harlem, they recognized the breadth of experiences as well. Although Johnson, an ardent integrationist, would not have credited it, Negro World, the weekly newspaper of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, contributed to this knowledge by reporting international news and featuring a column that was published in rotation in French, Spanish, and Portuguese, the European languages spoken across the African diaspora. This slide shows a UNIA parade in Harlem in 1920. And now let me see whether I can use this pointer. Okay, you can see, am I pointing to it? The Negro has no fear.
You have to press the button.
That would make sense. Okay, and there you go. Woo! The new Negro has no fear, and you can see the large numbers of people. The UNIA was the first mass movement among people of African descent, and it was organized, founded by Marcus Garvey, who was himself an immigrant from Jamaica, who came to this country in 1916. He'd organized the UNIA in Jamaica in 1914. And by 1920, and this is the kind of response he had, and during the 20s, the UNIA held very large conventions in the old Madison Square Garden. So they are right in the center of things in New York. As a mecca for the curious and the adventurous, Harlem drew pleasure seekers. Although it would take until 1937 for Rodgers and Hart to pen the tune, "The Lady is a Tramp," and I finally have an audience where some of you know that song, "The Lady is a Tramp." I say that to undergraduates and they go, "Frank who?" Yes, well, you remember then the line in that song in which the lady won't go to Harlem in ermines and pearls. All right, because Harlem is a place to go. It had a reputation in the 1920s as a place for rich whites to go slumming, which is why the lady won't go there. And certain clubs, including the Cotton Club, Connie's Inn, and the black-owned Barons catered to this clientele. Now, of course, the Cotton Club is probably the most famous club in Harlem. It was on the corner of 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue. And it featured broadcast every Sunday night that from 1928 forward were broadcasts of the Duke Ellington Orchestra. And so when F. Scott Fitzgerald refers to the 1920s as the jazz age, jazz is the soundtrack of the 1920s. And because of technological inventions, both records, so I have the young people from Haddon Heights High School never seen a record, but that's what we used to have before music was streamed. Okay. And that this music was then being broadcast across the United States. So you didn't have to go to the Cotton Club to hear jazz. You could listen in your home. But black patrons were not welcome in the Cotton Club. Blacks were only welcome there as entertainers or as waiters. Fortunately, there were other places in Harlem that did cater to black people, including the Clam House, Tilly's Chicken Shack, Bud's and Gerry's, and Mexico's, all conveniently located on the same city block. Carl Van Vechten was a popular novelist. Has anybody ever heard of Carl Van Vechten? Okay. See, that's what happens with popular novelists. They're popular then, and their fame goes away, their celebrity goes away. But Van Vechten was both a popular novelist and a well-known pleasure seeker, and he became notorious for leading white writers and celebrities on after-hour tours of Harlem. They could go to the Cotton Club. But Van Vechten knew all these other little spots and liked to take his guests there as well. William Faulkner and his publisher, Bennett Cerf, were two of those who went, quote, inspecting with Van Vechten, as the songwriter Andy Razaf put it. Van Vechten knew the hot spots, including those that served Negro clientele. Although he was something of a voyeur, he was also a serious student of the blues and a friend and patron to black writers, including Langston Hughes and Nella Larson. In a move that irritated many of the Harlemites who had welcomed him uptown, Van Vechten published a novel, and you will see it on the other side of the screen, titled, yes, A Nigger Heaven, in 1926. It became the best-selling novel of the Harlem Renaissance. Coy Van Vechten's Home to Harlem was runner-up. Some blacks could not forgive Van Vechten's title or his novel's content. The main plot told the story of new Negro professionals who struggled to hold on to their hopes even as their ambitions were continually thwarted by racism. The more memorable subplot was fueled by cocaine, orgies, and Satan worship. Both plots were exaggerated. Mary Love, the protagonist, was both high-minded and insipid. Lasca Sartoris, the evil seductress, also strained the reader's credulity. This is not to say that cocaine-sniffing seductresses were not part of the Harlem landscape, but devil worshippers were few and far between. James Weldon Johnson trumpeted the achievements of the enterprising and the talented in his essay, Harlem, the Culture Capital, that was published in The New Negro, the movement's signature anthology. James Weldon Johnson's essay documented the history of blacks in New York and charted the upward movement of blacks in New York City from Greenwich Village to the Tenderloin District, where we now call that Chelsea, where most lived at the turn of the 20th century, to Harlem. Harlem was not even part of New York City until 1873. Before then, it had been a farming village throughout most of the 18th and 19th centuries. In the 1870s, Harlem was transformed into an upper middle class suburb, Manhattan's first, Harlem, first suburb of Manhattan. The extension of the New York City subway to 145th Street in 1905 created a real estate boom, then a bust. The Afro-American Realty Company, founded by John Nail, who later became James Weldon Johnson's father-in-law, saw an opportunity and seized it. As a consequence, some blacks, newly arrived from the rural South, were the first to rent in several of Harlem's most elegant buildings. Right. They overbuilt. We're from New Jersey. We're familiar with this phenomenon. And then there was these empty buildings. And at the same time, there are black people coming from the South to New York City, and they find housing in Harlem. And this is a photograph of a group of migrants. The development of Harlem as the Mecca of the new Negro coincided with the arrival of tens of thousands of Southern blacks in the city, trading their familiar, if oppressive lives in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia for the promised opportunity of the North. They arrived daily, mainly at the Pennsylvania Railroad Station. Many took the subway to Harlem. Their arrival expanded the neighborhood's borders. By the end of the 1920s, Harlem stretched from the northern edge of Central Park to 155th Street, and from Lenox to St. Nicholas Avenue. It was more than 70% black. So like about 15 years, the complexion, the demographic of Harlem changes dramatically. Many newcomers struggled to pay the rent. Some took in boarders, and others hosted rent parties, which were perhaps the most inventive response to a necessity. And these are some of the cards that advertised the parties. My Haddonfield students, there's no internet. Many people don't even have telephones, so some do. And so they passed out these cards to let people know where the party was. Featuring foot-stomping music, often recorded, but sometimes performed live by Harlem's famous stride pianists, including James P. Johnson, Willie the Lion Smith, and Thomas Fats Waller, and serving down-home dishes. The parties were so popular that sometimes they were held even when no rent was due. No artist documented the invention of modern black identity more memorably than the photographer James Vanderzee. Many of the iconic images of the Harlem Renaissance, such as this one, a couple wearing matching raccoon coats with a woman standing outside the Cadillac in which the man is seated, and behind in the background you can see the Harlem brownstones. To Marcus Garvey in full regalia in one of his parades. That's Garvey, complete with the plumed hat and accoutrement. Other just portraits that people took of themselves. Vanderzee documented the development of Harlem as a black community. He took his camera around the neighborhood, taking photos of social clubs and dinner parties, dancing schools, and athletic teams. He composed portraits of the famous, including blues singer Mamie Smith, the dancers Florence Mills and Bill Bojangles Robinson, and the distinguished clergymen of Harlem. But they were not the source of his commercial success. His clients, this woman seated here, were just ordinary people. And they knew he was adept at making those who were not at all famous look equally distinguished. In his words, quote, "I could always see beauty where it didn't exist." And he would straighten out those crossed eyes, close gaps between teeth, eliminate crow's feet and wrinkles, and alas, sharpen noses to create the beauty that his clients could not see. Touched up and carefully lit. His photographs record people who know they are somebody, who are certain that their lives have meaning and value. As much as Vanderzee did to create images of new Negroes, as much as he staged portraits of them in their finery, he was keenly aware of the adversities that the camera concealed. In his studio, he kept a range of hand-painted backdrops, furniture, and props on hand so that his subjects could achieve the image of the success they desired. He even had a selection of stylish clothing for those who had not acquired the means to dress up to their images of themselves. Couples came to celebrate engagements and weddings. They came back to have portraits made of their children. If a child died, his portrait might be taken in the casket or in the arms of her parents. When asked about the staging of one of the latter, Vanderzee noted that the couple brought the dead child to the studio, where he arranged a home-like setting for the photograph. He explained that many children in Harlem died from pneumonia because, quote, it was a very common thing in those days for people to be without heat. That fact notwithstanding, his photographs focused on what his subjects had, a sense of optimism and possibility. If they had not yet achieved their goals, they remained confident that they could. And I would just, it's such an interesting wedding photograph, right? Because there's the projected offspring that is there, the image in the bottom corner. So Vanderzee, I mean, part of what did it mean to move from that image of those people, the group, the family? It seems like an extended family of migrants. Now I'm going to try to do something I probably shouldn't try. Let me see. There you go. To go back to them, and of course they are in their best on the journey from the South to the North, from wherever in the South to Harlem, but there's a great social distance between that family and this couple, right? These look like people, maybe they were not, who had never spent a day in a tobacco field, never spent a day picking cotton. These were, as they thought of themselves, new Negroes. And Vanderzee is a really important figure in documenting this psychological and cultural shift. Harlem's promise lured writers as well as ordinary folk. In Langston Hughes's words, quote, it was like a great magnet for the Negro intellectual, pulling him from everywhere. And that's a photograph of the young Langston Hughes. Aspiring writers flocked to the community. In 1925, Rudolph Fisher, a newly minted MD, came from Washington to pursue careers in both literature and medicine. After his 2-year fellowship at Columbia University's College of Physicians and Surgeons, he set up practice as an X-ray specialist in Harlem. His keen-eyed observations of Harlem by day and by night would be the focus of a series of essays, short stories, and novels. Chicago-born Nella Larson studied in Nashville and lived in Copenhagen and rural Alabama before moving to Harlem. Louisiana native Arna Bontemps and Utah-born Wallace Thurman came from California, where they were both employed at the Los Angeles Post Office. Knowing that both were aspiring writers, their co-workers introduced them to each other. When Bontemps' first poem was published by The Crisis, the official journal of the NAACP, published by The Crisis in 1924, he recollected that A, He received a copy of the August issue, which carried my poem. B, resigned my job in the post office. And C, packed my suitcase and bought a ticket for New York City. He later remembered 20s Harlem as a foretaste of paradise. Thurman arrived a year later. His 1928 play, Harlem, co-authored with William Jordan Rapp, a white writer and journalist, dramatized the conflicts around race, class, and ethnicity that the newcomers encountered. Like most migrants, Zora Neale Hurston moved north in stages. Starting from her home in Eatonville, Florida, she went to Memphis, then to Baltimore, then to Washington, D.C., before arriving in New York in January 1925 with, quote, $1.50, no job, no friends, and a lot of hope. Unlike most of the migrants who accompanied her on this journey, Hurston would leave Harlem and return to the South. Hughes, who would eventually be considered the poet laureate of Harlem, found the greatest Negro city in the world a source of endless inspiration. He set poems in cabarets, storefront churches, and railroad flats. Keenly attuned to Harlem sounds, he wrote blues and jazz poems, as well as poems inspired by gospel shouts. Harlem was a gift to all the writers who lived there, and they set numerous poems, short stories, and novels against its backdrop. Writers limned the streetscape of Harlem, echoed its soundscape, and captured its spirit. They depicted its people in their rich variety, in terms as superficial as complexion and as serious as class. More than the race leaders and boosters, writers were eager to probe behind the facade and measure the cost of the northern migration. They would consider the alienation that some Southerners experienced in Harlem anonymity. For the first time, people who had grown up in little towns in the South, they knew everybody in the town. Now they're in a tenement in Harlem, they don't know the family in the apartment next door. The shredding of old values. Nobody in Harlem cared. Did you go out last night? Did you go to church on Sunday? Nobody knew. There's this anonymity and the disintegration of families. In The City of Refuge, a short story that I think of as the story of the Harlem Renaissance, Rudolph Fisher captures the way that Harlem could dazzle the imaginations of newcomers, as well as the complex challenges that they sometimes failed to negotiate. The ironically named King Solomon Gillis, on the lam, after murdering a white man in self-defense in North Carolina, is disoriented by the clamor of Penn Station when he arrives in New York. The subway ride uptown further jangles his nerves. But when he climbs the steps at the 135th Street subway station, he feels that he has entered a haven that, despite all he has heard about it, he could not fully imagine beforehand. Harlem is a place where black is white. That is, where blacks are in control. Gillis responds to it with a mixture of insight. You had rights that could not be denied you. You had privileges protected by law. Insight and naivete. And you had money. Everybody in Harlem had money. The sight of a black policeman is confirmation that he has reached the promised land. Done died and woke up in heaven, he exclaims, then repeats like an incantation, even got colored policemen. Even got colored policemen. Despite weaknesses in the plot, the story's textured representation of Harlem is completely convincing. As Gillis first takes in the Harlem streetscape, he is struck by the plenitude of blackness. Quote, Negroes predominantly overwhelming everywhere, there was assuredly no doubt of his whereabouts. This was Negro Harlem. Later, Gillis recognizes the differences that the visible blackness obscures. Some of the people on the street speak an urban vernacular that Gillis needs to decode. Shines are working class blacks, and jaybirds are new arrivals like himself. Initially, Gillis is appalled by the intra-racial prejudice that US-born blacks show towards blacks from the Caribbean. But he soon learns to use the epithet monkey chaser himself. Whites are not merely whites either. Gillis gets a job with an Italian grocer who speaks his own vernacular and proves as gullible about the underside of Harlem life as Gillis. The strict binary between blacks and whites that governed Gillis's life in the South is unsettled. Gillis realizes too late that in the North, it is black people he cannot trust. Now, I was asked to prepare an outline for you this evening. I'm not used to preparing an outline, so things are out of order. So I am not about to conclude this presentation, even though I am about to turn to Sonnet to a Negro in Harlem. This is a poem by probably the youngest participant in the Harlem Renaissance. She was about 20 years old when she wrote this poem. Her name was Helene Johnson, and she came to Harlem, but not from the South. She came from Boston. And she explores in this poem the psychological stakes for those Harlemites who felt anything but at home. You are disdainful and magnificent. Your perfect body and your pompous gait, your dark eyes flashing solemnly with hate. Small wonder that you are incompetent to imitate those whom you so despise. Your shoulders towering high above the throng, your head thrown back in rich barbaric song. Palm trees and mangoes stretched before your eyes. Let others toil and sweat for labor's sake, and wring from grasping hands their meed of gold. Why urge ahead your supercilious feet? Scorn will efface each footprint that you make. I love your laughter, arrogant and bold. You are too splendid for this city street. Johnson's subject's regal bearing reflects both his pride and his disdain for a life that he is unable to master. While the poem emphasizes his physical beauty and the graceful stride with which he moves, it draws attention to his eyes and the hate that they express. Hate is not an emotion that James Weldon Johnson or Alain Locke or any of Harlem's boosters would have acknowledged. For them, Harlem signified progress above everything. But many of its residents did not achieve or share in that success. Whether his pride contributes to his failure is a question the poem does not answer about its subject. It suggests instead that his failure is a consequence of his refusal or inability to learn the ways of those he hates. The poem implies further that the subject would thrive were he at home where palm trees and mangoes flourish, a home where his thick barbaric song could resound. Barbaric is a jarring word for readers today. And read that sound. What is she talking about? But it was intended in 1927 to signal a positive racial difference. The poem's strength is its insight into the subject's alienation. The line, "Let others toil and sweat for labor's sake," does not reinforce a stereotype of laziness. It explains instead that what might appear to be laziness to the undiscerning eye is in fact resistance. The subject refuses to play the part society assigns. Were he to adopt the mantra of the enterprising new Negro, the poem suggests, it would be in vain. Scorn will efface each footprint that you make. The subject's contemptuous attitude becomes not simply admirable, in my view, it becomes heroic. That heroism makes him a deserving subject for a poem, for a sonnet. He refuses to be defeated, and the speaker rejoices in his spirit. Among the period's most poignant expressions of dislocation is Claude McKay's The Tropics in New York. The poem depicts the reaction of its speaker to a store window filled with fruits that remind him of home. The fact that they are sealed behind glass highlights the paradox in the poem's title, The Tropics in New York. Bananas ripe and green and ginger root, cocoa in pods and alligator pears, and tangerine and mangoes and grapefruit, fit for the highest prize at parish fairs. Set in the window, bringing memories of fruit trees laden by low-singing rills and dewy dawn and mystical blue skies in benediction over none-like hills. My eyes grew dim, and I could no more gaze. A wave of longing through my body swept, and hungry for the old familiar ways, I turned aside and bowed my head and wept. Capturing the fusion of pleasure and pain that defines nostalgia, the poem begins with a sonorous catalog of tropical fruits and ends with the speaker in tears. Several of the fruits are not native to the United States, and the metric pattern of their naming renders them both delicious and strange. The second stanza draws the contrast between fruit that is sold in stores and the fruit growing in nature. Words with spiritual connotations like mystical, benediction, nun-like, make the memories seem precious and the realities they invoke more distant. The words also anticipate the impact that his reveries have on the speaker. Brought to tears by the power of his memories, the speaker accepts the fact that he is unlikely to go home anytime soon. But the poem also redefines what is familiar and what is strange. The exotic fruits and the uncommon references. Parish fairs exist in Jamaica, not Jamaica, West Indies, not so much in Harlem. Rills are brooks that also are not part of the Harlem landscape. The exotic fruits and the uncommon references are rendered familiar, while the way of life in New York becomes strange. Compelled to identify with the speaker, the reader can empathize with his loss. Now, in 1928, McKay published the aforementioned novel, the second best-selling novel of the Harlem Renaissance, Home to Harlem. Home to Harlem has a feather of a plot. I just want to point to one thing. Let me see what I can put. The little blurb, a Negro's own novel for those who enjoyed Nigger Heaven, Porgy, and Black April. Some of you know that before Porgy and Bess was an opera, it was a novel. And so it's circulating, and lots of writing about Black people by white writers during this period, which is the reason that the blurb announces a Negro's own novel. Home to Harlem has a feather of a plot, as I said. As it opens, the protagonist, Jake, is working on a European freighter while taking a circuitous journey home after World War I. He's enlisted in the war, although the novel represents this as an impulsive decision. Black and brawny, Jake acts intuitively, not reflectively. On his first night back in Harlem, he hooks up with a prostitute, loses her, and spends the rest of the novel in search of her. Only in the end does the novel reveal her name, Felice. Were the novel more structured, it would collapse under the weight of the symbolic quest for happiness. But as is true of the protagonist, the novel's attention is easily distracted. It takes its readers to bars, speakeasies, and buffet flats. Buffet flats. Anybody ever heard of a buffet flat? Okay, a buffet flat was a private apartment that offered food, liquor, music, and sex. The characters in the novel mainly drink, dance, smoke dope, and copulate. In an infamous review in The Crisis, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that after reading Home to Harlem, he felt distinctly like taking a bath. He abhorred the representations of what he called the debauched tenth, the antithesis of the talented tenth, the educated elite he had identified in the souls of black folk as the vanguard of progress. Racial progress is hardly the point of Home to Harlem. It is an experimental novel that attempts to render the jazz-inflected life of Harlem in prose. Music is the backdrop for the situations that offended Du Bois. McKay represents jazz performance in its multiple dimensions: the voice, the instrument, and the dance. His narrator frequently calls out jazz players, much as a band leader would. He asks readers to listen for the saxophone, the piano, the drums. He works to represent the impact of the music on the body. Consider this description of a performance at Jake's favorite Harlem speakeasy called the Congo. Just read along with me. They danced, Rose and the boy. Oh, they danced. An exercise of rhythmical exactness for two. There was no motion she made that he did not imitate. They reared and pranced together, smacking palm against palm, working knee between knee, grinning with real joy. They shimmied breast to breast, bent themselves far back, and shimmied again. Lifting high her short skirt and showing her green bloomers, Rose kicked. And in his tight nigger brown suit, the boy kicked even with her. They were right there together, neither going beyond the other. The passage captures both the choreography of the dance and the real joy that it elicits in its performance. Let me step back just for a moment. I said Harlem was a gift to writers, right? There are so many new things happening in Harlem. The music is new. The dance is new. The location is new. How do writers capture that? All right, it's not difficult to describe the streetscape. It's difficult to describe the dance movement. And this is what McKay is attempting to do in this passage. The movement of the passage imitates the movement of the dance. Descriptions of action in the past tense yield to imitations of action in the present tense, smacking palm against palm and working knee between knee. Now, I'm not going to embarrass myself by showing that movement in the Charleston where they worked in, okay, because this audience knows what I'm referring to. Okay, I have an image for those of you who don't know. The passage uses repetition, verbalizations, and internal rhymes, working, grinning, lifting, kick, to produce the illusion of action. The word shimmied conjures a specific dance that was popular during the 20s, as well as the rapid movement of the hips and shoulders that the verb denotes. Tellingly, in a novel in which most interactions between male and female characters are laced with misogyny, sarcasm, and violence, the partners in dance achieve equanimity. Now, the Congo bar in McKay's novel was worlds away from the Cotton Club. dance was what they had in common. The popularity of black social dance, the Charleston, the Black Bottom, the Lindy Hop, and the Stomp soared during the 1920s. Another way that the 1920s become the jazz age is that all kinds of Americans are doing these dances that originate among African Americans. The desire to represent dance inspired visual artists as well as writers. As a caricaturist, Miguel Covarrubias has an edge. His art depended on exaggerating the human figure, and he shaped it in ways that mirrored the dance. Among his Negro drawings, 1927, were sketches titled Flapper, Strut, and Stomp. In this last Stomp, he drew a couple reminiscent of McKay's dancers. The female figure, clad in a short white dress, is leading the male, who is wearing a dark suit, white shirt, and bowler hat. The cane he is carrying becomes an element in the dance. And you can see that right there. The figure's torsos are elongated and arched. Her head is down while his is raised, but the legs and arms are positioned at similar angles, creating the impression that he is imitating her movements. So you get this a visual representation of the verbal representation in McKay's novel. Okay, I have one more image to show you. The desire to represent dance inspired visual artists as well as writers. An expanded representation of dance performance came from the Chicago-born painter Archibald Motley, who spent part of the 1920s in Paris, where he began to draw bodies in motion. While not explicitly in Harlem, this painting, also entitled Stomp, shares something of its spirit. The painting depicts a room full of musicians and dancers set against a mauve-colored background. The pianist, trombonist, and banjo player are there in the corner, entertain a room full of well-to-do dancers and spectators. The black and white piano keys create a pattern that is repeated in the black suits and white shirts of the musicians, and even in their faces. Dancing couples fill the center of the canvas. Some bodies lean into each other, others pull apart. One female figure in the foreground, let's see if I can find her, dances rapturously. Look at those pearls. She has totally forgotten that she is wearing her best jewelry. She is swept away in or by the music. Unlike the characters in the Congo bar, all the figures here are stylishly clothed. The female figures wear colorful dresses, clutches, and turbans. Their jewelry flashes, and like the trombone, light the scene. A solitary male figure, and you can see him all the way in the back, who's just sitting, he's not part of a scene, observes it. He's taking it in. Heavy-set and bald-headed, with a broad nose and large mouth, he sits on the sofa and observes the scene. His stillness contrasts with the dancer's movement. He models the engagement which the painting invites the reader to share. The painting makes no explicitly political point, but as Motley must have understood, representing Black Americans enjoying the pleasure of each other's company is a political act. Harlem in the 1920s was a city of dreams, realized, defeated, and deferred. The representations by poets and writers, painters and photographers, dramatists and musicians give us access both to the dreams and the material realities that both inspired and thwarted them. Thank you very much.